do it if you're so I wouldn't worry about raising unless you're getting some kind of nasty person who you need to take to the woodshed himself. So
Right.
listening to your reply would probably be more enlightening than not.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I wouldn't worry about that. The other thing I was going to suggest is why pick Substack other than the fact that your son recommended it? Why not just do a blog?
Well, I think it's partly technical ignorance. It just was something that got offered, and I thought, okay, this is
No, I know what you
seems to be easy enough, but I have no real understanding of how any of this works. Or how you get anyone to pay attention.
I don't read Substack regularly at all. I have it, but I got it for something else, and I can't remember what it was.
Yeah.
I have to go back and look at it, and maybe I can give you.
I'm certainly not looking to
Not a technical thing.
get a big audience or anything. A real reason for doing it is it makes me focus on what I think about something, put my ideas together, make it clear. It's a little bit like what these lectures do.
Well, that's what a blog does too. It's just
Yeah.
like writing a letter to the editor for the op-ed page.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
any kind of writing always does that for you. Makes you sit down and think it through.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, speaking of thinking it through, it's 2 minutes past 6.
Okay. I
Well, if any
started
of you are
recording.
interested and look it over and want to comment either directly or write back to me, that's just fine.
I'm looking for it, but I couldn't find it. I will find it eventually. Okay. So here we are.
Okay, shall we start? I don't
Yeah.
know
Well,
how many people are showing up today, but
maybe other people also don't have power yet. I don't know, but it's possible. So
How many signed up, Cheryl?
about 16.
16. Well, we've got
So
about
the
half of that now.
the earlier class was canceled or postponed, the earlier class today, which was due to be run at 1. And I think that was because of the outages. So it's maybe that people will end up not being able to get on. I don't know.
Well,
they can always see the recording when they get
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Well, let's begin. The last of the series, and in part, where I ended last time, I actually cut off a lot of information that is important in leading up to what I call the actual beginning of World War II. And I wanted to readdress some of that information in a little bit more depth before I concluded with a focus on Japan and the United States. So I went back and added in some slides beginning at this point, and I want to go through this as part of the finishing up, if you will, of what was going on in 1941. As I talked about last time, however, I'm not dealing at all with the German invasion of Russia. That is a huge topic, could easily take 8 hours in itself. And it's one of the most critical parts of World War II, and it just deserves a lot more attention than a couple of quick slides.
Mhm.
Italy, who joined the war in June after France was basically conquered, had some ideas of its own, which I talked about briefly before. Mussolini had moved from a particular focus on the ideology of fascism to rebuilding what he considered a sort of new Roman Empire. And as a result, he had taken certain actions, which, when he joined the war against France, led to some territory in southern France being turned over to Italy for control. And he also wanted control over Corsica. But more than that, he wanted to recreate that the Mediterranean would basically belong to Italy. Now, when the French surrendered, one of the conditions of surrender was that their navy, which was fundamentally the most important navy next to the British Navy in the Mediterranean, would all be interred or would be settled in French ports, but basically left in port. They would have no particular function outside that. This situation meant that Italy no longer faced a combined French and British fleet. It only faced the British fleet. And in certain areas, it looked as though the Italian Navy would be sufficient to support overseas adventures. So when you look at this map, you realize that, and as I talked about, the Italians had taken Albania pretty much for nothing. It was a walkover. And they had also controlled Libya from a considerable time previously. But in order to assert more dominant control in the Mediterranean, they wanted to take Greece and to move into Egypt. Now, they couldn't get into Greece overland. They had to have a supply across the Adriatic Sea into Albania, and then from there move against Greece. Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and so on were basically not going to interfere with this particular action, though it was somewhat of a surprise to Hitler that Mussolini would try to take Greece. But it looked like it would be a walkover, just as it was in walking over Albania. Similarly, though there were British troops in Egypt, the preponderance of numbers was substantially in favor of the Italians. So it looked again as though the Italians could really accomplish a great deal and prevent the British from really doing much about it. So they began these particular initiatives. Now, this particular complex map shows some of the actions that were taken and why the Mediterranean theater was particularly important and active during this particular time, 1940 and into 1941. And without trying to go into any particular details, I also wanted to show this little map down below that shows this particular route, which was going to allow for reinforcements to come up and aid the British troops in holding off the Italians when the Italians were crossing the border here into Egypt. This shows a little bit further eastern approach and shows some of the areas that would become involved in British reaction during this particular time of 1940 into 41 that would be critical, because it really produced a couple of different things. One is that with the withdrawal of British troops from France in the evacuation of Dunkirk back into England itself, remember that the British and those French who were brought over, along with some Poles and some Belgians, had left all their heavy equipment and most actually of their supplies, and many of their small arms had actually been left behind. So England was quite barren, and yet, because the British Empire was global, British interests meant that they had to become involved in protecting that global empire, or England itself would be isolated to such an extent that it would be unable to resist any further threats against its homeland. And despite Churchill's wonderful rhetoric and how they would defend England itself, it was impossible to lose sight of the importance of the empire globally. Now, when I use the word British troops, this means British and Commonwealth, and especially many troops came from India. So it's important to keep that in mind, that when I use that term, it doesn't mean that all these troops were English troops from England.
Scottish, Welsh, or
Now, when the Greek invasion began, as you can see from the map on the right, the terrain is really pretty miserable. And the Italians did not have any support. They couldn't bring any support through Yugoslavia. And Bulgaria was really not helping by threatening any part of Greece either. So it was possible for the Greeks to resist the Italian incursion, and it was very difficult country. The only mountain troops that the Italians had that is trained and conditioned to fight in the mountains was this particular division, the 3rd Division in the center that you see here. But the rest of these were rather ordinary divisions, infantry divisions with an armored division. But the armored division doesn't work well in the mountains usually. You need to have either a very strong combined arms structure for the armor to penetrate, or you're going to be stuck on roads, which can be interrupted rather easily. Also, as you begin this attack, you're hitting October. Now, October, this further south isn't as bad as October is going to be further north, but it still is difficult weather. And it can be rainy and clogging up the roads. You can have difficulty with mud and doing crossing terrain that isn't road networks. So all of this tends to be a problem. And you'll see over here, partly cut off in this slide, is that the landings were called off due to poor weather. So even the attempt to go into Corfu, for example, was deflected, not because the Greeks were particularly powerful, but because the weather itself was so bad. However, what the Italians learned was the Greeks were not a rollover. They were going to stick in there and they were going to fight. And indeed, not only were they going to fight, they were going to win. And this was quite a problem for the Italians. Now, when they see that their supplies, which have to come by sea and then transported up to the front, are not as simple as they would have hoped, they find themselves blocked. And then within a short period of time, they're actually being thrown back to the point where they're almost going to be driven even from Albania. I mean, this is getting particularly dangerous as the months went on. On top of it, Greece, of course, now looks for assistance. And the only organization or the only country capable of assisting them is Great Britain. And the only troops that are readily available and can reach this theater of operation have to come from Egypt. Why is that important? Because as I talked about in the last lecture, the Italians had come into Egypt, but very quickly stalled. They just bogged down and as a result went into a defensive structure. Now, what that did is turn the initiative back over to the British, who, even though in a very strong sense were outnumbered, had considerable mobility, and they had a better doctrine with which to attack the Italians. And as a result, not only did they defeat the Italians in Egypt, they drove them practically out of Libya entirely, capturing over 100,000 troops at a small place called Beit Afam, which was on the far western portion of Libya. And the few remnants that escaped into Tunisia, basically, and hunkered down there because now the British had basically outrun their supply lines. They had traveled over 500 miles in order to drive the Italians out. With that success, and at that particular point, seeing what was going on in Greece, the British commander there, Wavell, was instructed by
Bell.
Churchill to send troops.
Bell,
I'm sorry?
All right. Janet, I'm sorry.
Huh?
I think
oh,
it's,
I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
that's all right.
Okay. Basically had to send troops and therefore supplies and logistical support and all the rest of it to Greece. Now, Italy was in serious trouble. And as we move into the early months of 1941, one of the things that was very important at this time, as far as Germany was concerned, was that the blitz against England to bring her to her knees with air power had been unsuccessful. The British were standing tough. So Hitler turned east in order to attack Russia and achieve the goals that he had outlined years before in Mein Kampf. That is to develop what is called the free land or Lebensraum that would hold German colonists. The Slavic population in that area would essentially be enslaved and then destroyed. And this would give Germany hegemony over Central Europe to such a degree that it could now resist any outside attacks or outside pressures. So he was preparing to launch this attack into Russia, but because of Mussolini's failure, indeed his defeat that was occurring not just in North Africa, but was occurring here in his invasion of Greece, he now was called upon to try to help his ally. It was important not to let Italy collapse at this point. So two things happened. One is that some German resources were sent to North Africa, and that became known as the Africa Corps under General Erwin Rommel. We'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. And he needed to clear the Balkans in order to prevent the British and Greeks from co-opting the other Balkan nations or forcing them into a form of neutrality, which would remain a threat to the German right flank as it attacked Russia. So Germany had to intervene, and their intervention meant that they had to bring considerable power in order to crush the Balkan nations very quickly. Now, there were some political shenanigans going on, which I won't get into at this point, but the key element was that Germany diverted considerable resources in April down into the Balkans and basically conquered the Balkans, and then with cooperation of the few remaining Italians, if you will, was able to crush Greek resistance. Now, the British, who had come in to assist the Greeks at this particular time, now found themselves once again caught. Because they still controlled the sea, based on the ships that they had in Alexandria, for example, they could still muster enough naval force to bring in the ships and help with the evacuation, though pretty much the entire Greek army had to surrender. Now, when they did that, they retreated back to the island of Crete, because this island was big enough, and as you'll see, not very far from the North African coast. And if this fell to the Axis powers, then it could mean interdiction of the very important sea routes that the British relied upon to bring supplies and troops from their holdings further to the east, especially India, but Iraq and Iran and so on. And if this was all taken over by the Axis forces, they could easily interdict this area. So they wanted to hold Crete. This is a different representation, but the reason I show it isn't so much that anyone's going to pay attention to the various details, except that as the Germans began to move in, they were able to convince both Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary to allow German forces to develop and to some extent assist in the destruction of the rest of the Balkan area and crushing Greece. And as you'll see, the retreats that occur all the way down and eventually pass into Crete itself. Turkey managed to maintain its neutrality through all of this. This kind of shows how the various occupations worked out. And what you'll see is that in order for Bulgaria to join, they have to be given something. Well, they're given this, right? And we can see that they occupy these areas in order to keep the Greek area subdued, but also to sort of pay them for what's happened. And this gives them a nice opening into the Aegean Sea. In fact, Germany controls all of this until late in the war. With the British now on Crete, the Germans still see that there's an opportunity because, as I mentioned, if they hold this island, it can be turned into a very sore point for any supplies that are going to come up through the Suez Canal and cross the Mediterranean. If this is cut, then all that support from further east, India and so on, has to travel all the way around Africa. And that is a very long journey and subject to submarine interdiction because you disperse the Navy so much that your submarines can really concentrate and attack. The Germans developed a combined arm operation called Operation Mercury in order to attack Crete. And I use this term combined arms when I discuss the invasion of France itself and also Norway. So the Germans were practicing a very complex art of combining different forces into particularly layered approaches, which allow them to be successful in something as difficult as reaching across the sea and landing here. This particular approach forced the British to respond, and as Crete fell eventually to the German forces, the parachutists, the airborne, and then finally sea landings, as it fell, they also had to evacuate. And this was a somewhat costly approach. At the same time that, remember, the British forces in Egypt had been weakened. And because the British forces were weakened there, when the Germans came into Tunisia under Rommel and then consolidated themselves with the remnants of the Italian army in Tunisia, they could now attack into Libya. And this put a real strain on British resources in this location. So this particular attack that's occurring here has repercussions that extend considerably elsewhere. This is just to show how complex this landing is. So you have parachutists, then you have airborne troops coming in. You try to bring in seaborne troops. You have mountain troops that are able to handle this difficult terrain and so on, and eventually force the surrender of Crete. Now the British are really stuck with a couple of different problems. One is that, as I mentioned earlier, the French fleet was largely held in ports under French control. And with not only the isolation of England, that is, that the continental France has been taken over, but there's a number of powerful French ships which are supposed to be kept under Vichy control. And if the Germans try to take those ships, the French admirals are supposed to either leave port, take the ships somewhere else, or they're to scuttle them. But at this time, think about how your own reactions would be. Are you going to depend upon the goodwill and actions of the French admirals in the face of German pressure? Or are you going to do something more dramatic? And in this case, Churchill felt that there was really only a couple of options. One, the French should bring their ships to British ports and join with the British to resist Germany and Italy, or scuttle their ships themselves so they couldn't be taken by the Germans or Italians, or Britain would try to destroy them. And over here in this lower list, you'll see some of the ships. These are only some of the major units that are involved, but look at the number of destroyers and submarines down here. If these fall into German and Italian hands, the balance of power in the Mediterranean is going to change considerably. As a result, through Churchill's initiative and sent to his Admiral Somerville in the Mediterranean, he basically says, you've got to make a decision. Sail with us, sail with reduced crews to a British port, sail to a French port in the West Indies where you could just sit out the war, and maybe the United States would take control of them. Sink your ships within 6 hours. I have orders to use whatever force to prevent your ships from falling into German or Italian hands. Well, the French weren't going to do that. So they left the British with destruction. At Mers el Kebir, which is near the coastal city of Oran on the north coast of Africa, and at other ports, the British took the initiative. The one place where they had some luck was in Alexandria, where there had been some French ships there. But many French ships remained still in French ports like Toulon. And those ships stayed there until the collapse of Vichy France. The attack that the British carried out was to try to destroy as much of the French Navy as they could. And this was one of those things where you just, unfortunately, have to fight a friend. And this left bad feelings among many Frenchmen throughout the remnants of the French Empire, if you will. Also, because de Gaulle had left France with the collapse of the country, he had gone to England and he was trying to stir up a French resistance called the Free French. And with the assistance of the British, he wanted to establish French authority in one of the colonies. He didn't want to remain in England where he would be under the thumb of Churchill. One of the places that appeared to be favorable was on the west coast of Africa at a place called Dakar. And again, the same thing happened. The idea was, he hoped, de Gaulle hoped, and Churchill hoped, that with the combined Free French and British forces appearing at Dakar, the Vichy French would surrender, if you will, and turn themselves over to the Free French and join the resistance against Germany. Didn't happen that way. And indeed, unfortunately for the British and Free French, they took a bit of a beating there. So the British Navy not only was concentrating its effort in protecting the homeland from invasion, I talked about Operation Sea Lion during the last lecture, but now they're actively engaged throughout the Mediterranean and along the African coastline. Now, the British also have not ignored what is happening with Japan. So the British Navy is still strung out globally in a lot of different areas. It's impossible to concentrate as heavily as they'd like. And the other part of the British Navy is spending time chasing down surface raiders that Germany has gotten out into the Atlantic. The Gaff Spey was one of the ones that I mentioned during one of the previous lectures. Now the British also began to worry about the Italian Navy, which was quite modern and had a number of very fast and well-armed ships. The British decided that there was a possibility to launch a surprise attack against a major Italian fleet at Taranto. How would they do this? They would use aircraft, torpedoes, to sink those ships, not just bombs, but torpedoes. And indeed, they launched this attack in November of 1940 and were remarkably successful. As you can see down below, 3 battleships disabled, 1 heavy cruiser damaged, and so on, at minimal loss. Now, some people have pointed to this and said, oh, well, this is, the Japanese learned of this and therefore decided they could attack Pearl. I find that questionable. I don't find the documentation to support it, but it's an interesting speculation that the first port attack using torpedo bombers was by the British against the Italians, and it was very successful. If you look at the torpedo bombers, they were biplanes, and there was a particular term they used to describe them, which was not very complimentary, we'll put it that way. But if you could get past the anti-aircraft fire and so on, or catch them at surprise, you could do a great deal of damage. And this shows an aerial photograph that was taken. These particular ships with smoke pouring out of them, a big oil slick that's developing. This was really quite punishing for the Italians, rocked them back considerably. Now, remember I said England had other global requirements, and their particular emphasis in their global requirements was to look at the protection of their supply lines from their colonies into England and to Egypt and so on, where they had major concerns. Well, if you look at where Ethiopia is, and you look here at where you're going to go up to the Suez Canal, it doesn't take much to block this. And this is Italian. Remember, in 1936, the Italians took over Ethiopia. So if the Italians maintained sufficient strength here, they could easily block this. Well, the British had to divert resources, which they did. They consolidated in various areas where they had control, and you can see them here. And they basically crushed Italian resistance within a relatively short period of time. And by what I mean by that is that it was impossible for the Italians to make use of the strategic position during the course of all this fighting, because they're fighting for survival. And because the Italians here do not have any clear logistical support that can come from other areas, they basically run out of steam, and their job is just to hunker down and weather the storm as best they can. And you'll see that the final resistance doesn't come until a number of months later. But this is not the end of what the British have to do. This map shows a sort of a graphic of all the areas where Britain has to be engaged and the particular concerns that they face. Here is where the Italian and German forces are threatening Egypt. Syria was a French protectorate. Now, with the collapse of France, this could become German controlled. There had to be actions taken by Britain to prevent this. And then you have Iraq and Iran, which are very important sources for fuel. Down here, as I mentioned, you had the Italians controlling Ethiopia and Italian Somaliland here. So you can see that the dispersion that the British were called upon to manage was extraordinarily complex. Interestingly, there was an invasion of Iran. Most of us don't remember that or even think about it in terms of this particular conflict. But what was important about it was that the British had to maintain control, particularly in the oil areas here and all the way up to outside of Baghdad. But notice what happened. The Russians came in and took some territory as well. Now, this is August of 41. And for those of you who are aware or remember from what I said before, Germany attacked Russia in June of 41. So on top of what Russia's facing is a near catastrophic set of events that occur in the summer and fall of 41, they still are able to muster some support to help drive down into this area. And eventually this will be one of the routes of supply that the Allies use, the US and Britain, to help keep Russia with enough material to resist the Germans. Iraq, as I point out, in just bringing the map down a little closer, shows how forces are used in order to try to keep these areas under British control when either Vichy France or the Germans may try to make it work for them. Syria was yet another example of it, and as a result, there had to be action taken to control these areas and control the Eastern Mediterranean. Remember, Turkey remains neutral throughout this whole thing. And finally, just again, I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. When we come back to this next set of discussion on what's happening in North Africa, the reason I show this is one of my little things. The logistical support to armies in the field is something I'm very interested in. How did they do it? How did they get the supplies there? How much did they need? And so on and so on and so on. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the concentration of the British, particularly in this area and along the Eastern Mediterranean coast, was critical to maintaining this supply that could go up through the Suez Canal, and that they were particularly concerned with German incursions that were going to come from the west, from Libya, because of the diversion of forces they had to use for Crete and Greece and how that weakened them. They had to find a way to resist all of this. The other part that was important, and I listed here lines of communication a little bit more critically, show the important sea routes that were involved for both Italy and then Germany used these routes, but also that if you had aircraft staged in different areas, how you could control the central Mediterranean. And this little place right here, Malta, and this place here that I've spoken about already, Crete, emphasize how critically important these small regions were. Now, when we look here at the proximity of Sicily to Tunisia, it also seems very evident, and since they controlled Sardinia as well, it looks as though if there had been sufficient air power placed in these areas, that shipping would not be able to get through. For some reason, that just never happened to the degree that one might have expected. And therefore, throughout the war, though there were certainly costly convoys that went through here, the British were able to maintain this line of supply. But it's important to get the geography down in order to understand what the important elements were that were going to control functions or actions that were going to be taken by the various powers. Now, I talked about this last time in terms of the incursion of Graziani under the Italian leadership and how they got stymied and held up here near Sidi Barrani, and they built some forts along here and then were outflanked by the British, driven all the way back across Libya. A good portion of the army surrendered here. They didn't have a Dunkirk possibility, and the remnants retreated off. But while the British were diverted into Greece and Crete, even though the German forces that were sent here were not massive by any means, they were mobile, and they had the right doctrine. And because they had the right doctrine, they could drive against the weakened British forces and basically travel all the way across Libya, driving the British all the way back to the borders of Egypt, except for this little place of Tobruk. This is the guy that masterminded it, Rommel, and sometimes known as the Fox of the Desert. He was considered in the German hierarchy initially as a somewhat lower level division commander during the invasion of France in May of 1940. But his 7th Armored Division was so fast in its movement, he pushed them so hard that it became known as the Ghost Division, that the Allies couldn't seem to find it. He was always on the move, always going somewhere else. He became, in a sense, then an ideal commander, initially given corps control, which was several divisions, but because of his talent and the German presence, he basically became the leader of the entire Italian-German force. But he was an aggressive leader. He used every asset he had available, and within remarkably short period of time, as I just showed on that previous slide, was able to drive the British right out of Libya. And this is another sort of graphic example of driving it all the way back. So they are starting here. Don't worry about the red lines going the other way. That's a different issue we'll come to. But he drives all the way out to the borders of Egypt, except for Tobruk. And the British, actually, it's mostly Australians, are hanging on to Tobruk. Now, why does that matter? Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just give it up and go here? Because Tobruk was a big enough port that supplies could be brought into Tobruk, shorten this long, nearly 800 plus miles of distance that you'd have to travel to bring supplies to your frontline troops. So Tobruk, holding Tobruk, was a critical element. So the British hung on, and in hanging on, allowed the interruption of supplies to stall the Germans and the Italians. This particular terrain I showed in a previous slide is very mountainous. There's an escarpment that passes through here that's almost impassable to vehicles of any sort. The British are able to concentrate themselves back in Egypt and build up their forces, and eventually they will attack the Germans. This shows a little more graphic example of Tobruk. I'm showing this in some detail because of the importance that is attached to this place. And that is that the Germans attack it in a couple of times. This is called the Easter attack. I'll show these in a slightly larger view in a moment. And the salient attack, as it's called, where they drive in and almost threaten to take Tobruk, but they're held off. This is the kind of defensive work that was created around Tobruk in order to deal with the oncoming German attacks. The terrain was not completely flat. There are lots of hills and valleys and crevices and things of this sort. But basically, fighting in North Africa was very much by analogy to ships at sea. There was a lot of maneuver. There were no particular places that you could deem secure. So all around defense became very important. And this is just an example of how this might have been set up. You have an anti-tank ditch, you've got some machine guns, you've got trenches, you have mines, you have wire, and so on and so forth. So if the enemy breaches any of these particular areas, he still is going to find himself under fire from here. This shows just the idea for what the fortifications look like, how the perimeter is held well out here. Notice the distance of 5 miles that's here. And the idea is that you want to be out, so you want your port outside of artillery fire. So you need to hold these out further. You can't be back in here defending, or you're going to lose. This was the Easter battle in April when the Germans try to penetrate. They're able to break through in one place, but they can't sustain it. All of these different strong points provide fire from different angles. And as I showed you with all around defense, the idea is that even if they get behind you, you can be shooting at them. So this made it very difficult if you can't crush these defenses completely. And the other attack, which occurred later in May, early May, was an attempt to drive the British back. Now here they were more successful, but even then, these are contour lines. And if you can hold somewhat higher ground, because you don't have trees and things of that sort, you have a very long field of fire. And back in 1941, German tanks, particularly those in North Africa, were not heavily armored. They weren't the bigger, heavily armored weapons that one hears about all the time. These were basically not toys, but they certainly weren't indestructible by any means. The British began to consolidate their efforts and decide that they need to drive Rommel back. In order to do that, they launched an attack in May of 41 when some of the very high pressure is occurring against Tobruk that I showed you in the April and May slides, the Easter attack and the operation against the salient. But as was becoming evident for the British, they also were beginning to struggle. They had taken many losses, and their opportunity to advance the way they had against the Italians just wasn't there when you begin to deal with the Germans. The doctrine, the weaponry is all different enough that you're really in trouble. So Operation Brevity indeed was somewhat brief. The idea was to penetrate this barrier, if you could, and get into more open and maneuverable areas where your troops could begin to get around these flanks and penetrate to Tobruk. Didn't happen. So the British have to hold back. They take enormous losses, particularly in their armor. So they regroup, they rebuild, they bring in more tanks through the Mediterranean. Interestingly, they're able to make that run. And they try again, Operation Battle Axe. And again, even though it looks like they're going to be successful initially and they make some advances, the German counterattacks drive them back and they have to start over. Tobruk, though, is still holding out because they control the port at enough of a distance that transports can come in and bring supplies, food, ammunition, even reinforcements as needed. And finally, under Operation Crusader, the British are finally able to muster enough force to begin to beat the Germans. And at this point as well, the German supplies across the Mediterranean have been cut up a good deal. So the shipping that they need for fuel and ammunition has been interdicted to a fair degree, not entirely, but it means that their resources are limited. So once they get to a certain state of fighting, they have only a choice of being destroyed in place or getting out of Dodge. And that nearly happens to them as they're almost cut off during part of this attack that goes on and begins to rush towards Tobruk, which is up over here in the corner. And even a division from Tobruk begins to break out to try to seal this gap and prevent these troops from withdrawing. But the Germans are able eventually to get out. And as the British forces move to the advance, and there's a lot of maneuvering that occurs here, they're able to escape, and then they're chased again by the British all the way back. Here's Beta Fam again, but this time the Germans and Italians get out of there and they get back to El Agheila, where they can again set up their boundary and hold off the British, who now are at the length of their own supply line too. This particular defeat, if you will, has repercussions as well, occurring as it does during one of the most critical times in the Eastern Front. So as Rommel was making great progress and then engaging with the British, he, of course, was saying, I can be more successful. If you give me just a few more troops, if you get me some more supplies, I could probably beat the British, and maybe I can go all the way to Cairo and drive the British out of Egypt. But it's not going to happen. The commitment in Russia is so immense that Rommel's lucky to get anything at all. That he does as well as he does on a shoestring is really a tribute to his mastery, if you will. Now, one of the things I show here is, again, to show the global nature of the fighting, even though I haven't called it a world war. But in 1941, we see the number of ships lost at different times. This is a cumulative effect through the entire war. And for some reason, the years got cut off there. I'm sorry about that. But it shows how destructive, look at the total losses, 4,549,000 gross tons of shipping lost. Most of that coming from the British. But the point is that when you are taking losses like this, you're really teetering on the edge of defeat. It's not just a matter of starvation, though that becomes a critical issue, especially as England is concerned, because they don't have the resources to feed their people, but it means in every aspect of it. So this is becoming a critical element that we're not going to talk much about in terms of the Atlantic and other areas. I've alluded to this, and as I said, I'm going to pass by it. It's extraordinarily important. Let's take a short break, if that's all right now, and then I'll take the rest of the time to deal with Japan and the coming conflict with the United States, and then how that brings on global war. Why don't we just say 5 minutes, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them to the best of my ability.
Return at 7.
Yeah, so we'll just wait 5 minutes, Henry, if that's all right. So, Jerry, haven't seen you in a long time.
It has been a while. I'm enjoying listening to you. I know you spent a lot of time studying and presenting on this topic.
Well, it's been a fun deal.
Yeah, you do a great job.
Thank you. Have you been to any of the other ones? I just don't remember.
I was at your first, missed the second, although I have a recording and I'm going to listen to that. I haven't been as tuned in as I should have been, but I'm enjoying your presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
You
Well,
must,
it's been exciting. So what have you been up to all these days?
well, I'm doing some, I'm not deeply involved in legal work right now, although I just got off the phone as I started to tune into you. I got a call from the Shenango County DA asking for some advice, and I'm involved with a fellow that I was on the Binghamton University Alumni Board with. He's trying to involve me in a nonprofit organization dealing with basically the message. It's called the Braver Angels. Its purpose is to involve citizens in discussing issues. The message being, we can discuss issues even of where we have dramatically different viewpoints, but we can discuss these issues in a civil way. It's really focused on, we need to refocus our citizenry on civil discussion if we're going to maintain our democracy. So I'm just getting involved in this. He wants her to get involved on bail reform discussions and that kind of thing. So I found that intriguing, and I respect this fellow, Bill Groner, that is soliciting me. So we'll see.
But Jerry,
Yes.
aren't the very people that we are having the biggest problem with not the kind of people who engage in civil discussions? They attack the Capitol, they, do various other disruptive things, and they're not rational. And I don't see, it's all well and good that you have a different point of view, but that's where we were before all this nonsense began. How do you start that discussion, so-called discussion? Seems to me that's the point.
Well, no, good point. And I'm doing a lot of reading on it. One of the last books I read was How to Speak to Science Deniers. And it's a good point. There's certainly at the far ends of the spectrums, you're not going to influence those who are, for instance, deep into the social media netherworlds. But I have to believe, because I still have hope for our democratic system, is that there's a very large number of citizens who, if we can involve them in the discussions, that they're still the people who determine elections and determine major decisions at the end. The moderate middle, are there as many as there once were? Probably not. But, I've talked to juries and grand juries for a lot of years, and I find that there's still a lot of rational people if we solicit their involvement. So this is my
Those are not the
optimistic-
ones we have to worry about.
Well, no, but if we're always going to have to worry about the extremists.
Well, and Henry, the other thing I think Jerry's hitting on is that if you can serve as a model for civil discourse, then perhaps some of those people who are overly passionate in their expression, not in their beliefs, but just in the way they express themselves, maybe they'll find a better language to use when discussing their ideas. And that in itself can shift how you listen. That's the way I interpret what you're saying, Jerry. Does that seem reasonable?
Yes. I mean, I'm not going to carry on too long here, but the last book I read, I found it interesting, and it corresponds actually what the Braver Angels sort of mission is. This book, this guy wrote this book, he's a philosopher. And he said, I wanted to find out, because there is so much science denying, I want to understand how we got here and how we can reach. And basically the path of his book was, I decided I'd first start with the extremes. I went to a national flat earth convention thinking, well, look, if I can have discussions with people that I would consider this the most extreme of science deniers, I'll learn perhaps how to move or to engage. And he went in and immediately became advocating and presenting facts and this, that, and the other thing. And he found that was a failure from the start.
Total non-starter.
So his last paragraph, his last chapter of the book was about, this is the way that I believe we have to do it. Number one, no matter what's being said, you have to be willing to listen. listen and know that at the far extremes, you're never going to change their minds or their positions. But for a certain percentage of people, if you listen, if you speak respectfully, if you provide information when they're open, that you can have influence, and you're not going to do any better or more than that. Just keep that in mind. It made sense to me.
All right. Well, let's get back. I don't know if
Get
everyone
back to the real
has
world.
shown back, but here we are.
You do
All
it
right.
with-
This next set is going to discuss some of the steps that led to Japan attacking the United States, Britain, the Netherlands, and so on. And in my view, eventually led to this being a truly World War II. And one of the things that I talked about in the past in different lectures had to do with how Japan rather remarkably and rapidly moved from what we would call an almost feudal Middle Ages type society into a major industrial and military power, particularly showing its strength in the very end of the 1800s, and then with its defeat of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05. And in World War I, while she was not engaged militarily directly with the contending powers, at the end of the war, she ended up gaining control of a number of German territories in the Pacific region. Following that, in the 1930s, particularly 1931, and then more aggressively in 1937, Japan took on China. And this particular move that was taken had a great deal to do with two elements in process. One was the Japanese perception of itself, its domination in the East Asia region, and her own particular drive that we could couch in the term of national interest, but it went beyond national interest. The Japanese attitude, which I'll talk about a little bit as we go to some of the other slides, was in some ways as racist as it was in Nazi Germany. And because of that particular approach and the ideology which that describes, used her military power to achieve her national interests at the expense of her neighbors. And it wasn't just a matter of territory, it was a matter of subjugation. And you can really only subjugate if what you're subjugating is considered less important, less valuable, just a lesser being in this particular case. This particular slide shows some of the major acquisitions that occurred from the late 1800s into the 1930s, and shows that Japan, while still had considerable territory under her control, lacked any real access to the resources which were vital to a modern industrial nation. In the previous lectures, I had shown a slide about oil. The United States back in 1940 was #1 in the world in production of oil. Japan and China weren't even in the top 10, of course. So the major resource that you need in order to have a modern industrial nation, particularly one that is military oriented, as the Japanese structure was, you've got to have energy. And energy at this time meant access to oil because coal burning ships no longer were useful. You might use coal in factories at home, but what you really need is oil for your shipping and for your engines, literal engines, gasoline. So as a result, the Japanese decided that it was time to expand her empire so that she could become no longer reliant on other nations providing her with resources. Her major supplier of oil was the United States. The United States also supplied her with a considerable amount of steel. So both of these things you need if you're going to be a modern industrial nation. In 1915, I go back this far because it emphasizes some of the elements I've made through many of these lectures about the importance of ideology, not just nationalism, and how things are constructed in the international affairs based on your ideology. Without trying to read this whole slide, though some of you can read it faster than I could speak it, there were a series of demands that were made against China in 1915, basically all of which would have subjugated China in its entire to Japanese control. This was not something that China was going to do very willingly. There were some territories which she might have been able to cooperate in working with it. But also remember that at this particular time, China as a nation was in chaos. There was an enormous amount of almost civil war occurring on a regular basis in China. And it took powerful leaders like Chiang Kai-shek, who eventually came to control it, or Mao Zedong, who controlled the Communist Party, to use quite literally an iron fist to try to unify the nation. But when these demands were made, China was still in great chaos. The other thing to remember is what was happening in Japan, because the Japanese approach was going to become destructive towards any country she occupied, towards the people, the indigenous people in those regions. We have to kind of look back a little bit and try to figure out what was happening in Japan. How did it get to this particular situation? And what I want to just point out is that one of the key things that happened is that while the Japanese Imperial Army in the 1920s was only 300,000, remember, because she didn't take part in World War I to speak of to any degree. But the new constitution meant that the war minister was accountable only to the Emperor Hirohito. The army took over basically the government and was able to keep the emperor, who still had ultimate authority. The people who feel or have said that, you know, Hirohito really was a puppet to the military are not quite accurate. Hirohito knew and agreed with what was going on, and if he didn't agree with what was going on, changes had to be made. But the key element was that the administration under the emperor was basically run by the military. When there were civilians who became involved and tried to liberalize some of the strictures in Japanese society or in international affairs, a number of them were removed from office, either by forcing resignation or quite literally by assassination. So within Japan itself, the militaristic, nationalistic spirit was growing enormously. Part of this might be traced back to the Russo-Japanese War, because when that was concluded, Japan felt that she wasn't given all that she had earned in defeating the Russian army and navy in that conflict. Nonetheless, there was this national spirit rising up, and it led to further engagement in China. And as we see here, just in the Sino-Japanese War, the idea that the Japanese overran China obviously is not correct. Japan struggled in a lot of different ways to defeat the Chinese. In any particular conflict, oftentimes the Japanese destroyed the Chinese resistance. But there were a number of situations in which Japan got a bloody nose. That encouraged more and more commitment of troops and resources into China itself. It was as though, quite literally, you sort of had your hand on the tail of the tiger. And now it was going to be very difficult to let go. This particular engagement also changed the strategic views of the government itself. As I had talked about in lectures previously, the actions that took place in Manchuria, were largely done without the agreement of the central government, but was co-opted into it, accepting it because they couldn't afford to basically back away from what had happened. But the deeper their engagement became in China, the more the central government began to support those initiatives and look to achieve whatever success was going to be in China. The basic problem was that, like many conflicts, if the strategic goals are not clear, if you haven't defined what victory means, then you just end up keeping on fighting. China did not have some of the resources that were vital to Japan, which is an interesting paradox when you think about it. It is much analogous to what Italy did when Italy attacked Ethiopia. It looked to be an easy thing, but once you had it, there was basically nothing there that was useful to you. And indeed, Ethiopia for Italy, in a way, just became a waste, pouring in resources, not getting anything much in return. Now, when you have Manchuria, you do have access to a lot of mines and resources that you can use to help make steel and things of that sort. But what about the rest of China? How much is there for you to use, especially when there isn't any oil? So this becomes a drain on resources. In some of the discussions I've made before with parallels with the fighting in Ukraine, it often comes down to a similar kind of thing. How has either side determined what constitutes victory? And in doing that, how do you muster your resources in order to accomplish those goals? Here we see that when Japan takes casualties, and just notice this, 21,000 in one battle, all right? Another battle in 1939, 40,000 casualties. And here, another 8,000. Think of what those numbers mean to us today, and then put it in context that you have back then. And imagine how you have to control the home front in order to accept these kinds of casualties. This kind of situation does reflect much of what was going on in Japanese society. So while Japanese society did have very repressive aspects to it, there had been a cultural conditioning that had gone on literally for centuries. And in that regard, made things like this more acceptable. But this only represents these. There were ongoing casualties literally every day because the fighting never stopped. I bring these points out here because Japan is a maritime nation, and yet her commitment right now is primarily in her army. This sets up a very different tension among the military leaders between the army and the navy. If you're a maritime nation, it means you have to control your routes of supply to the homeland. And the only way you can do that is to have a powerful navy. Yet Japan had been circumscribed, if you will, by some of the treaties that were drawn up in the 20s and 30s in order to allow nations to demilitarize to some extent, but at the same time recognize their relative importance in the global arena. So the 5-5-3 ratio that was set up between Britain, the United States, and Japan sounded as though Japan wasn't getting enough respect, if you will. But considering the global nature of the requirements for the United States and Britain, Japan was actually given a very solid position. Nonetheless, with her incursions in China in particular, she was brought under criticism by the League of Nations and withdrew from it. And when she withdrew from it, she also withdrew from the Washington Naval Treaty that had set up this ratio and had constrained a number of different categories of production, not just battleships, but of a whole host of different warships. Japan created the largest, most powerful battleship the world had ever seen in the Yamato class. There was the Yamato and the Musashi. And these were named after samurai warriors. They were extraordinarily powerful. And in the last lecture, I showed one of the shells from the Yamato. It was just enormous. But she began to build aggressively to match the fleet tonnage, not just in the location, but actually to match it globally. So she was trying very hard, not just to become dominant in the East Asia region of the Western Pacific, but to actually assert herself now as a direct threat to the United States and Britain. The leaders in this buildup I have listed here. I'm not going to worry about who they are for anyone to remember. The quiz at the end of the lectures is very straightforward. And I think, you know, you'll all get the chance to weigh in. But the important part is that these are military people. Okay, they're running the government. So their attitude is going to have a particular bent, not just in how things are handled domestically, but how they're going to be handled internationally. Similarly, when we deal with China and Chiang Kai-shek, and he's now become the ascendant leader of the nationalists, but we've got to deal with this guy as well. And he had his own issues with Chiang, so that much of the time, the two of them were fighting each other as much as they might be fighting the Japanese. This diverted any coordination of activity, but over time, actually Mao's communist army became more powerful, more adept. And that led to the collapse eventually at the end of the war of the nationalists by 1949. This shows what was going on in 1940. And what you can see as we move into 1941, remember, Japan is not involved in any global conflict. This is not a world war from her perspective, that she's begun to push incursions. And in 1941, especially when war does formally break out as a world war, takes over much of the coast of China. But notice down here, French Indochina. One of the things that happened with the collapse of France was that now all of those colonies that were elsewhere outside of the mainland of France were now under Vichy French control. But the French had no real resources down here that they could muster. So diplomatically, if you will, Japan was able to force the French Indochina region to be turned over to her and let her have air bases and naval bases there. I list this as Japan goes to war, sort of, because at this point, she still is primarily engaged in Asia. Emperor Hirohito takes over way back in 1926, but he lasts until 1947, when eventually he is just emperor of the state after Japan loses. Kanoi had been the prime minister and helped navigate Japanese actions through these growing years. When she was separating from the League of Nations, she was beginning to go her own way and was going to begin to challenge any authority in East Asia. And then eventually this gentleman takes over. Right, I know. But at the same time, these guys were also remarkably adept in their own particular way. I show this slide, which I've shown before, not for anyone to worry about, but I'm just showing the kind of depth of activity that takes place. And down here, the scale of miles, all right? So penetration from Manchukuo, as they call it, or from Manchuria, is hundreds of miles in. This takes an enormous amount of logistical support to do, and in the process drains resources from the mainland, or you have to create them and bring them in. And again, if you're using vehicles, you're going to burn up a lot of gasoline in the process. This again just shows how the Japanese empire was extending and would extend once war actually broke out. But these were the critical areas she held. Here's where she was encouraging in getting into China. But the question was, eventually, she wasn't going to conquer it all the territory. What she wanted to do was control the government. And in that, she failed. In addition, with the collapse in Europe, she joined in a move with Italy and Germany, the tripartite pact, as you'll see here, and directed specifically against the Soviet Union and Britain. In the last lecture, I talked about the fighting in the borderland between Russia and Japan. And although Japan was initially successful, Russia really returned and gave her a terrible bloody nose. And after that, basically, they established a sort of non-aggression pact between them. You know, you don't bother us, we won't bother you. Now the US is becoming very concerned about this growth of Japanese power and where this is going to lead. Roosevelt is stuck in the middle of a very difficult situation. First, the management of the Depression had come under a great deal of criticism, and his domestic policies that were designed to get us out of the Depression, at least according to not just current historians who've looked back at it, but even at the time came under severe criticism as actually worsening it. That's not an argument I'm here to try to address. I don't know enough about that stuff. But the other part was that there was still great dissension within the United States as we saw what was unfolding in Europe and in the Far East. The initial impression, and remember, there's a very large German population in the United States at the time, as well as a not inconsiderable Japanese population, particularly in Hawaii and on the West Coast. So Roosevelt acknowledges that these people are going to have an influence in what's going on locally, that is domestic politics. And it's going to have an influence in how he tries to navigate this very difficult situation that is unfolding before him. The United States, in a sense, wanted no part of another European war. Listen, those guys just can't settle their hash. They fight all the time. They've been fighting each other for centuries. Why should we spend blood and treasure trying to get them to fix their problems? It's up to them. We had more sympathy for China, not because we had a close affinity to them or that there was even a very large Chinese population here. In fact, there was a much larger Japanese population by proportion. But at the same time, there was this sort of humanitarian concern. And it took a long time before Japanese actions began to press against what we thought was our national interests. It wasn't just a matter of trade with China or trade with Japan or things of this nature. It had to do more with the behavior the Japanese were beginning to demonstrate. And that in itself raised deep concerns. Roosevelt still had to find a way to navigate it. One of the things that was done as the war in Europe particularly got out of control, if you will, was to declare this area of what's called a security zone. Now, the idea behind this was particularly important because of that word Panama. For the United States to get ships from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you had to go through the Panama Canal. If you had to go all the way around South America, that was just a non-starter. And that particular area had to be protected from both Germany and from Japan if they began to press too hard into the Western Hemisphere. So although we had the Monroe Doctrine dating back into the 1820s, which served as a notice to any nation outside of the Western Hemisphere, it was still recognized that this particular location of Panama was absolutely critical, and we needed to have a way of telling other nations, steer clear. All right. Now, the other value of that is if they steer clear, then we're likely to remain neutral. So this isn't just a security zone to protect us and the ability to move a fleet or to transit goods and things of that sort. It's also a way of just saying, listen, if you don't mess with us, we'll try to stay out of this conflict. But as we saw the collapse of France in particular, and Britain alone, and the challenges Britain was facing, we now needed a shift. And therefore, we moved, I'll call it our security boundary, way over. You'll notice how close it is to the coast of Africa and how it goes through Iceland. And in my last lecture, and I'll show you here again what happened there, and it includes Greenland. So we have pushed ourselves further to the east in the Atlantic in order to try to maintain not just a matter of stay out of our neighborhood, but now we're beginning to lean towards assisting the United Kingdom in its resistance to Germany. This is a description of a picture of the American fleet as it's in San Diego. And one of the key things you'll notice is this huge number of destroyers that are all lined up. And you'll see these stacks on them. A lot of these destroyers were First World War vintage. So they were 20, 30 years old. They were reaching the end of life. But Britain needed destroyers to serve as escorts for their merchant ships. And remember, I showed you the merchant ship losses that had occurred were enormous, even in 1941. It was worse in 1942. We made a deal with England to trade 50 destroyers for bases that basically help protect our perimeter on the Atlantic side, including down into the Caribbean. You say, well, if you give up 50 ships for those bases, what are the bases doing? Well, you can put air power there, for example. So you have to build up your Air Force in order to make having those bases worthwhile. But again, it was another way of sending a message that we will do what we can to protect our region, even if it means temporarily stripping away 50 ships, which would otherwise be needed for convoy escort duty, as an example. It also put us in harm's way in the Atlantic, because by declaring security zone that you saw in that one slide, and then our boundary, if you will, further to the east, it meant that we could sort of prosecute shipping that was coming into that area. We could look at it and kind of say, you really don't belong here. So for German submarines in particular, this could get to be a little dicey. And indeed, there were some incidents that occurred that weren't good for either of us, but drew us closer to the war. In addition, Roosevelt made some amazing initiatives, which really came very close to the line of engaging the United States without us actually having a sort of declaration of war. He was able to push that envelope right up to the limit. So the Neutrality Act was one. That sounded pretty benign, except in terms of practice, it really wasn't. But more importantly, the Lend-Lease Act. Because what this basically did was cut off German ability to get supplies from the United States. That is, you can have something if you can come here and get it and pick it up and take it home. You can pay for it, and that would deplete your coffers. But then we kind of said, well, but I'll tell you what, you can borrow it. And actually Roosevelt used this phrase, you could, if your neighbor's house on fire, you let him borrow the hose and then he just returns it when he's done with it. Or if the hose gets destroyed, he'll replace it. But you're not going to bother to sell it to him right up front. And that was part of the deal that went on. And then with the Atlantic Charter and these other events that we've talked about briefly, he got us more and more closely tied to what was going to happen to Britain. The Atlantic Charter I bring out here just as an example of what I talked about in the interwar years and even during the lectures in World War I. And that was the similarity that you'll see here to Wilson's 14 points. Why does this matter? Because what has happened now is this is not an example of the strategic goals of the United States as such. This is an ideological expression. This is what we want the world to look like. And this particular kind of approach is one that we as Americans particularly look at and say, who can argue with any of these things? I mean, this looks like the best way for the world to operate. What we forget is that the USSR, which I'll just call Russia for sake of ease, and Germany and Italy had their own ideologies. Japan had its own ideology, couched more in militarism and subservience to Japan itself, but all had a vision for what the world should be, how the world should be constructed. And these ideologies clash. Depending on which ideology clashes with which, it can have an absolutely brutal outcome. In other situations, that clash is moderated considerably. And we could talk at length about that in terms of the fighting on the Eastern Front, the fighting against Japan, the fighting in North Africa, and things of that nature. Some of the people who were important in the American government leading up to the war, I'm just going to show briefly. I'm not going to talk at length about them because I want to get to something else before we conclude. But this just shows that people here through this period of time had to spend time thinking about where the United States was headed. What were the major threats that the United States was facing? And what do we do to lessen those threats? Or if we can't deflect them, then prepare to engage. And this is a complex, difficult situation to manage. We were fortunate that we had far-sighted people at the time who seemed to understand where the world was going and what we could do on our end. And yet, when you look at the American Army in particular, not the Navy was much more aware of what was going on and preparing for it. The Army was struggling. And as is ever seems to be true in our history, when we get into a major conflict, our Army is just not there. And it's sometimes amazing that we're able to recover from some of the beatings we take and adapt as quickly as we do. The Navy, on the other hand, they have to be very aware and ready to go from day one. And this involves enormous distances, different kinds of warfare. And these people had to help direct it. So I mention these because I think it's just worth getting an idea of it. Now, I talked a bit about this in our last lecture. I'm going to go over it very quickly. The United States takes Greenland. Well, this was Danish. Denmark has surrendered. Technically, this land belongs to the Danish government, which is now subservient to Germany, and therefore, under the treaties of surrender, German forces should be permitted to land here. We weren't about to let that happen. So we take Greenland. What about Iceland? Remember, I showed you that line that had shifted far to the east, right, almost to the coast of Africa. And when you go up north, cuts through Iceland. Well, the British had occupied Iceland at this time, in spite of Denmark surrendering and technically being German. And then over time, because of the threat to Britain itself, Churchill and Roosevelt talked to each other and said, we'd like to get the British troops out of Iceland, bring them back to, I'm sorry, this is Greenland. I go to the next one. Bring them back to England and let them fight there. And instead, we just said, okay. And we worked out a deal where we could take it. The other one was the Faroe Islands right up here. Now, notice this particular arrangement is that if this is under US control, it means that supplies coming from Canada, from Halifax or from the East Coast, the northern East Coast, can pass through the North Atlantic and have some protection from units that we could base here. So this again was a deal that would make it much more usable and useful to Britain. This is what happened in Iceland. I'm sorry, I got my slides out of sequence a little bit. So in June 41, turned over occupation to the United States, and basically we moved in and took over places, as you can see. Now, other people who are responsible for the buildup of us getting ready for the war had to contest with domestic problems because the United States, while in the last, say, 30 years has spent a great deal of money on our armed services, back then it was considered a drain. And with the social programs in particular that Roosevelt was putting together, the military was really not getting much support. The Navy got more, and remember that Roosevelt, I think, had been Secretary of the Navy during the time of World War I, if I remember correctly. And therefore, the Navy tended to get a little bit better support, the Army much less so. This particular gentleman, though, who came in and took over as Chief of Staff, it was absolutely brilliant. And he was so vital to the conduct of the war that when Marshall wanted to lead the invasion of France in 1944, Roosevelt told him, I can't afford to lose you. We've got to find someone else to do it. So Marshall did not get to lead the troops in battle that he had solely wished to do. But he hung in there. And the other part was that Roosevelt would sometimes call his generals by their first name. Marshall wouldn't have it. So Roosevelt always had to address him as General Marshall. And of course, in return, he would say, Mr. President. Henry Knox, Secretary of the Navy, took over and controlled much of the expansion. An aircraft carrier has been named after him. This gentleman I mentioned because he's not known to most all of us, but the importance of him is this. He was Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet up until 1941. And when Roosevelt, seeing the threat that Japan was offering, wanted to move the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, argued against it. He said they just are in a bad place out there. The logistical support is not what it should be. We can still react properly and aggressively if something should happen, which was only anticipated to be in East Asia and the far West Pacific, not in the Central Pacific. But he was eventually replaced by husband Kimmel. Ernest King, also a critical area, eventually ended up as not just Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, but he also became chief of naval operations. I mention this because this was unusual for a single person to hold both posts. And one of the things, Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet was abbreviated as CINCUS. So they changed the name later on because CINCUS didn't sound right, especially after Pearl Harbor. Now, I mention this part because it's just a quick reprise of some of the things that were going on, but key area is what's down here. And when I talked about ideology in Japan, we don't think of ideology the same way in Japan as we do in, say, Nazi Germany or communist Russia. But think about what these terms are: bringing the 8 corners of the world under one roof. This was Japanese control. Bushido, the way of the warrior. This is how they were going to fight. This becomes a real determinant because the way of the warrior is very different from the kind of attitudes you saw expressed in the Atlantic Charter by the United States, and the way of the emperor. Okay, these things had a great deal to do with not only what Japan was going to do or what she wanted, but how she was going to fight. Now, I'm going to spend a few minutes. There are a lot of slides and I'm going to go through them quickly, so don't despair. We've got just 20 minutes. The idea behind showing war plans is important because it shows you the intellectual adjustments that have to occur as circumstances change. It's something that we tend not to think about, especially in current situations. And I'll again use this analogy that I used somewhat during the last lecture, and I've used repeatedly in even the preceding lectures 1 and 2. And that is, if you look at the conflict in Ukraine and you ask yourself, what kind of planning took place? Why do I really care? What's my point in even bothering with hearing the news about Ukraine? What do I really care? And what does this mean, more importantly, to how the United States or the European Union or other nations around the globe are going to respond? I point these things out because the very issues of military conflict are studied very deeply by all the people who not just involved directly, but everyone who's trying to draw conclusions about what modern warfare means. I used this phrase before in the sense of this: technology drives tactics and tactics drive technology. Now that's how you fight. So if you want to engage with a ground force, you think about what technology do I need in order to be dominant? And then how do I train in order to use those weapons effectively? But if I run into a situation where that's not working, I need to adjust my tactics, and therefore I may have to adjust my technology. And if we look at what's happening in the Ukraine and Russia and the kind of weapons that are being used, or at least talked about, in a number of blog sites that I happen to look at just out of interest, what is really interesting to me is that we're talking about weapons which are used by 1 or 2 people sneaking up on a convoy or taking out a tank or other armored vehicle, when not too long ago, especially if you want to look back at the first Iraq War, that's all tanks on tanks, aircraft blowing up tanks and things of that sort, big weapons, big technology, very expensive stuff. And now we're seeing something very different. So looking at these plans has to show us in part of how technology changes, plans change, technology changes. Early plans. This goes back to what all nations do in part is to project, set up scenarios of different enemies they may encounter. It doesn't mean that they're going to go to war with them. We had plans against Britain prior to World War I, for example, right? mean, just, if the British decide that they want to fight us, what are we going to do? What you notice is that the areas that are controlled by Japan are basically southern directed. This is where all the oil resources are going to be. But notice this, Siberia, to be occupied if the war goes well. This is Eastern Russia. Okay, because Vladivostok is right down here, and that's main Russian base for their Pacific Fleet, and it's a warm water port. Notice that they do talk about Hawaii, but they talk about air raids by seaplanes. So this is not a devastating attack at all on Hawaii. And instead, the focus will be on using submarines to try to interdict our lines of communication. Okay. So all of these things are designed to carve out a section and hold it, keep the United States at bay. Notice that there's no real engagement with Australia other than just raiding. As the technology changed, aircraft carriers became an important element because the Japanese realized that if they really want to dominate this kind of area, which is water, you need air power. Well, you get part of that by militarizing various bases on which you can place aircraft, which can attack naval forces that are trying to penetrate it. But more particularly, you also need a mobile force, and it has to have aircraft. And the only way that happens is if you build aircraft carriers. And after the abrogation of the Washington Treaty, one of the things Japan did was begin to build aircraft carriers specifically designed as aircraft carriers. The early aircraft carriers that they had were basically converted from other hulls that were intended to be built for something else, but under the treaty arrangements was not considered possible. Also notice that now there's no particular emphasis in going north. One of the great strategic arguments that took place in Japan in late 1930s was after the occupation of Manchuria and the beginning of a real war in China, was this fighting that took place along this border with the USSR. The idea was that the army, as I showed you in the previous slide, thought that maybe they could move north, either directly north or this way, and cut all this off and make it part of Japan's occupied territories. But with their defeat by the USSR, they no longer were interested in that. And the southern option became the dominant option. And that meant the Navy now was critical for a couple reasons. It's less critical if your primary emphasis is here. But if you're moving down here, you need the Navy to help protect this whole line from incursions from the United States. And this also means that because you're using the Navy and its very high consumption of oil, you have to have oil resources. Those are down here. So in a sense, strategy drove the technology and the technology helped drive the strategy. I showed these because the US had been practicing for war against Japan in the Pacific, because who else are you going to fight? Not China, and certainly not Russia. So your only major opponent out there is going to be Japan, which was building up its Navy. So we had a lot of different actions that were being taken every year, basically, and sometimes twice a year, in order to figure out how that war was going to be fought if it should ever come to pass. And as a result, there were a number of plans called War Plan Orange that were developed over several decades. I show these quickly now just to give you some idea. This is back when we don't have aircraft carriers. So this is all surface related. You have large distances involved, and it looks as though Japan is going to protect the homeland and then They'll be striving down here. There's the Philippines, which is United States territory as a result of the Spanish-American War. And now there's going to have to be some fighting, and how do you get there? As the plans mature, different choices are offered. This approach rejected. The first choice is here. Notice that this choice goes up towards Midway and not down through the southwestern Pacific region. That changes, of course, when the war comes. Why did these happen? Because part of what they have to look at is how far do you have to travel? These distance ratios are very important. The further you have to travel, that means the further you are away from your supplies, your bases, and repair. You know, the Moskova in the Black Sea just recently sank en route back to a port after it had taken damage. And that wasn't a long distance to go, but it was damage. Now that ship is gone entirely. By 1922, again, we're now beginning to look a little bit at aircraft carriers, but their job is primarily observation. Get out there, find the enemy fleet so we can engage it with surface forces. But what you'll notice now is that we're no longer looking to go in this direction. We're going to come further south. We're going to come this way. By the way, for those of you who are interested, the Solomon Islands down here now has an agreement with China. And there's real concern on the part of Australia that the Chinese may begin to send military forces down there. The other thing that has to be considered is how quickly can you put your units together in order to fight. And this just goes to show you that M-Day being the day that war breaks out, 30 days, 60, 90, and so on. You begin to see the different approaches and mustering of support that can be done. But notice down here, Marine Corps and Army, because they're going to have to land on some of these islands and occupy them, but there's no intent at all to get into major land combat with the Japanese. This is still considered very much a naval affair. And as we move into the 30s, you begin to see a slight difference of approach. Now you begin to see the importance of air power. You see how the Japanese are, in our thinking, putting up a barrier which is going to have to be penetrated. The Philippines at this point lies behind the barrier. It's not quite clear if this has been totally occupied or just cut off, but the main defensive outposts are going to have to be taken. Again, different approach. Do we go straight across? This was a big argument between Nimitz and, why am I blocking? MacArthur, in terms of coming this way or this way. But this just gives you an idea that you have a shorter distance, but now you're going to have to run a gauntlet to get there. So if that's the case and the Philippines have fallen, maybe we should shift our approach elsewhere. All these little red aircraft are Japanese. You're going to have to get past all those. You're going to take a beating. In fact, from the Japanese standpoint, this was almost what they preferred us to do, because they felt that by the time we'd gotten through this gauntlet, their Navy could come down and intercept us with overwhelming strength. So this, again, was something they were looking at. Just a few years later, now we've changed our approach again. Now we're beginning to think maybe Britain can get involved in this conflict, because the Japanese are going to have to travel all the way down through here and try to occupy the Philippines and the oil regions. Well, the British can put some forces there. Well, we know what happened. Basically, their two major ships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, are sunk, and Singapore falls after the Japanese land here and drive down the Malay Peninsula. Finally, in 1940, Singapore now, okay, we feel that's going to be written off. Here's the limit at which we're going to have to see penetration, the kind of economic strength that the Japanese are going to muster, but we're still looking at coming in from the south. And we just didn't appreciate at this point just how well the Japanese would conduct their fighting. By the time we're almost at the war, okay, location of forces actions on day 5, okay. Here's Pearl Harbor, all right. We have carriers at sea, and our expectation was we might be able to intercept the Japanese fleet as they come this way to set up a barrier. We still didn't understand, and it's reasonable under the circumstances, that they would actually attack Pearl itself. And right up to the start of the war, that was still not considered feasible, although Richardson, whom I showed earlier in a slide, had been concerned about the vulnerability of Pearl. Even Kimmel had some concern about that, but he was given a different set of instructions about what to do, and therefore ended up being, frankly, unprepared for what was coming. I show this correlation of forces because if you go back to the Washington Treaty of 553, you begin to see a very different kind of structure that's going on. It looks as though the United States has more battleships, but notice in the Pacific, there are 9 because we had to commit the others to the Atlantic. The Imperial Japanese Navy had 10, and remember, 2 of them were the most powerful ships ever built and could outrange anything that was even comparable in name, much less in armament. Notice the number of carriers that you see here. We only had 3 in the Pacific Fleet, 10 in Japan, of which 6 were used to attack Pearl Harbor, and so on and so forth. So the correlation of forces began to move very favorably towards the Japanese as the war went on. Kimmel, as I mentioned, was commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. After the debacle at Pearl Harbor, he was removed from office. And then Walter Short, who was in command of the Department of Hawaii, also removed afterward because the Air Force was part of the Army. We didn't have a separate organization of the Air Force. The Army had an Air Corps, so he was responsible for it. And as some of you may recall, their biggest concern allegedly was sabotage. So the planes were lined up on the tarmac so they could be guarded rather than dispersed and or set into shelters where an air attack would be less effective against them. We'll finish up pretty quickly with these last few slides, and then I'll save time if people have questions or want to hang around. This again just shows a timeline of the different things that happened and why the United States began to shift its emphasis heavily towards looking at Japan as a real threat. And as we see, there are a couple of things that were actions taken by Britain when they agreed to close the Burma Road initially, and then opened it back up in October. But the US, because of the Japanese taking Indochina from, remember, the French had surrendered, Japan negotiated a way of using bases there, and we embargoed steel to Japan. But also, as we get down here in July, we froze assets, partly in response to the Japanese occupation of Indochina as well. So we're putting the screws on Japan pretty heavily at this point. And we did that in appreciation for how dangerous it appeared Japan was becoming. As we see down further, we eventually cut off oil. And when we do that, that for Japan basically threatens, it's like a chokehold on your throat. You've got to get that pressure off or you're going to die. And that meant, in terms of what the United States was offering through Hull's proposals, was from the Japanese standpoint, non-negotiable. We will not yield up our sovereignty and our national interests in order to have you take your hand off our throat. Instead, we'll cut your hand off and we'll find our resources elsewhere. The Japanese Empire, as I had mentioned, had grown considerably by taking over German territories, militarizing the islands, which they weren't supposed to do initially, but once they abrogated the treaty, they did what they wanted. They had strategic resources they were looking for and needed to control, but ultimately it's oil here. There was some oil in Burma, but they were a long way away from that and making use of it. They needed that. Yamamoto took over. We've heard, if you pay any attention to any of these things, this man is well known to most of you. He was the person who organized the attack against Pearl Harbor. Now, most of us, and I strongly recommend, by the way, that you watch the movie Tora, 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 because it is one of the best examples of the lead up and the organization and the attack on Pearl Harbor is seen from both sides. It's really important. There are a couple of phrases that are mentioned, which I put here because it's from our perspective, the United States. Most of historians have shown great respect for Yamamoto, not just for organizing this raid on Pearl Harbor, which was quite successful, at least it appeared to be successful, but for his recognition that now with the United States angry about what's happened, that this is going to lead to Japan's defeat. And it's mentioned as though he's the only person who really saw this. Actually, the Japanese leaders knew this was the case. They understood that taking on the United States was a huge risk. And as they developed their various war plans, and the argument between the Southern strategy and the Northern strategy that I alluded to earlier, recognized that the only way they were going to be successful, excuse me, was if they inflicted enough damage on the American Pacific Fleet to buy them considerable time to build up their defense perimeter. So they had 3 different phases in which they viewed what was going to happen. The first, in the sense, was to damage the Pacific Fleet to such an extent that they would have time. The second, strengthen the barriers. And the third, develop the resources within the area that they conquered in order to supply them with enough resource that they could at least fend off the United States and make reconquering these areas too painful. They could end up with a negotiated solution. The alternative Japan faced was giving up their aims altogether, because one of those things was to get out of China. And that meant that Japan would be subservient to the resources of the United States. And if we turned off the spigot, then they would be in deep trouble. Think about the concern in Europe when war broke out in Ukraine, that maybe the Russians would turn off the gas lines and oil to Germany and France and the rest. 40% of Germany's energy came from Russia. You turn that all off, you're in a world of hurt. And if you remember back just a few months ago, Merkel was saying, we're going to still buy Russian gas. Okay, we need that. Ernest J. King, crusty, abrasive, but very, very smart guy who really understood how the Navy needed to function. He took over after Kimmel got removed. He had deep distrust and frustration with the British in particular. And Nimitz, you've all seen, ran the Pacific Fleet after the debacle at Pearl Harbor. And again, a masterful strategist and tactician. What ultimately happened December 11th, Hitler declared war on the United States. There was a pact between Germany, the tripartite pact that you saw, Italy and Japan. But under the circumstances, Hitler was not obligated to declare war on the United States. Yet what had been happening in the Atlantic, which I showed on previous slides, was such that from Hitler's perspective, the United States was already in it. They were supplying, we were supplying Britain, we were giving them all manner of goods and services and all the rest of it. He knew that the small conflicts that were erupting in the Atlantic between the American Navy and German submarines in particular was a problem. And he just said, screw it. We're just going to declare war and get this, this fakery all done with. Unfortunately for him, just about the time that he declares war on the United States, the conflict in Russia takes a very bad turn for the Germans. So his timing was not great. Well, anyway, that's it. I thank you all for attending. I hope that you found it illuminating, rewarding, useful, nap time, whatever. And thank you again for attending. It's really an honor that you show up for these. If you have questions, I'm happy to do it.
This is a greedy question, but will you do the rest? Will you, like in next winter, will you continue?
You guys really want to continue to get punished like
Oh,
this?
yeah,
No,
Yeah, we got to find out how this all turns out.
right.
I'll give you the short version. We win.
Exactly.
There's so many different issues, like I did read that the German attack on Crete was a model of a new kind of warfare using carriers or air power and naval.
Yes. And actually, another interesting spin-off of that was that Germany took such bad casualties that Hitler was loath to use paratroopers again.
Yeah.
The Russians tried it in the Russian fighting. And also, when you landed at paratroopers, if they were not linked up quickly with ground forces, they generally got overrun.
Mhm.
Put that in context of what we did when we invaded Normandy, as an example. And it shows you how the shifting of training, doctrine, equipment, all has to meld together. The Germans were well ahead of everybody in understanding how to meld these together. But because of the bloody nose they took on a number of different occasions, it rocked them back enough, but other people learned valuable lessons and learned how to respond to them.
It occurs to me that when the last thing you mentioned about Hitler declaring war on the United States, that he could have been under some pressure from the Japanese too, to do that, because if most of the U.S. fleet was in the Atlantic and he didn't declare it, and sooner or later we didn't need them there, we would have sent them to the Pacific, right?
I think that's true. The thing that I think is also evident, though,
Evidence
is that,
for it?
I'm sorry, Henry.
Is there any historical evidence for the fact that the Japanese were leaning on Hitler to do that?
There was only the indication that they sort of, when I say leaned on him, they didn't have any real leverage.
Didn't have any leverage, that's the point.
Right, because in return, if you look at what happened during the war, the two theaters, that is the Pacific Theater and the European Theater, really operated almost independently of each other. The Germans did try to send some resources to Japan, but they could only do that with submarines, which meant that what they could provide was very, very limited. There was some attempt to share intellectual property, I'll call it, development of different things of that sort, but ultimately it was of negligible value to either side.
Okay, thanks.
It seems possible that if he had not declared war on America, the American public would have not wanted to fight Germany, but would have wanted to deal with Japan.
I think that's one of the things that is a valid question, because when Japan hits Pearl, all of our attention suddenly shifts. I mean, you have 3,000 people killed and a whole battle line basically destroyed in a surprise attack that I haven't gone into how that all happened. That's a whole different story. But it shows up well in that movie, by the way, which isn't as long as one of these lectures. And you get to eat popcorn and all the rest of it. The important part is that whether Hitler declared war at some point or whether we would have declared war on him is one of those lovely questions. And it would have been harder for us to declare war on Germany when we didn't see our national interests as threatened directly as they were when Japan not only attacks Pearl Harbor, but takes the Philippines and Guam, which were US territories, and American troops in the Philippines who eventually surrender in February of 42. They hold out that long. And the United States gets word of the Bataan Death March and gets aware of the torture and the dehumanization of American prisoners. This was something that turned the Pacific War, and I'm going to use a strong word, it's a little bit too overdrawn, but it becomes almost a race.
Yeah.
It's really an ideological war because the Japanese viewed anyone who wasn't Japanese as inferior. That's just the way they saw it.
Yeah.
And their culture, the samurai spirit, was you don't surrender. You give your life to the emperor. So if you're put into a bad situation, you either take as many of the enemy with you as you can, or you kill yourself. And that just wasn't the way we thought. But when we encountered it and had people that were tortured, mutilated, whatever, said, screw that. The only good Japanese is a dead one. So kill them all, you know, and no mercy, because you're not going to get any in return.
Curious, given the success of the British destroying the Italian and French fleets in the Mediterranean, that we weren't more aware of the sitting ducks at Pearl Harbor.
That's an excellent point, Tom. I think the biggest issue that I've uncovered in the books that I've read and the stuff I've looked at is simply that it was an intellectual mistake. That is, that we thought less about what the enemy was capable of doing than what we thought he would do. So if we had taken the approach that they're capable of attacking Pearl Harbor, then how do we engage our forces to defend against something like that? And we were simply fortunate that the aircraft carriers were not in Pearl when that happened. They were at sea. And the other part that's an interesting speculation is if the American fleet at Pearl had actually mobilized and gone out to engage the Japanese fleet, all those ships sunk would never have come back. They're at the bottom of the ocean. Whereas being sunk in Pearl Harbor, all but I think 2 of them actually ended up getting refitted. And even if they were not up to the modern technology, we could use them for shore bombardment and things of that nature. So in a sense, we were actually lucky they attacked Pearl Harbor.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to attack dinner.
Thank you ever so much.
See you next time.
These
Well,
are so much
thanks
fun.
to all of you again. I truly appreciate that you come to these. It
Well,
really is an honor.
I'm with Tom. We need to see who wins this thing.
Yep, yep. We do.
Well, if there's a
Those
next
are
set of
two guys,
lectures,
yeah.
just to warn you, I'm going to spend a lot of time on the Russo-Japanese conflict.